Right, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Dani Kahil, and I'm a practice lead at Empire Australia. And for today's topics, I'll be presenting about envisioning Power Platform and Dynamics 365 solution using design thinking. Before starting, a big thank you to the Dynamics.com community. Thank you for voting for my session. Great initiative in general where people can vote so they can really see the interest of the community. So thank you very much for that. So yeah, back to the topic of today. So I'll be covering about design thinking and envisioning for your Dynamics 365 and Power Platform projects. And really what happens a few months ago, I really started using and learning about design thinking. I wrote a couple of articles, and then essentially today my session is about sharing my experience and my best practices on using design thinking on your Dynamics 365 and Power Platform implementations. For the agenda of today, I have a little bit about envisioning, and effectively, I want to cover this because this is very important when using design thinking techniques. So I'll describe what is my definition of envisioning and how I understand envisioning. Point number two, I'll cover a little bit more about design thinking. What is design thinking, and how I translate design thinking to Dynamics 365 and Power Platform implementation. Item number three that I'll be sharing with you is my ideal envisioning journey. So how the journey of the envisioning and using design thinking applies to the Dynamics 365 and Power Platform project I deliver. Again, it's my view. I consider there is no one way of doing an envisioning or an implementation. This is my way of, in my journey of the steps required. And then the four points will really dive into more details about some design thinking methods I really use during my project envisioning for the Dynamics 365 and Power Platform project. And I will finish with some best practices. So that envisioning journey and those design thinking methods that I'm sharing, I'll be also sharing with you the best practices on when to use, on which type of project to use which, how to pick and choose maybe some, because not every project is kind of different. So this will be my take on some of the best practice on this. So this is really for the agenda of today. So first, as I said, let's start with envisioning, right? And if I pick the standard definition about envisioning is to imagine as a future possibility, to visualize, right? But what does that mean, or how do I understand that on the Dynamics 365 project? Is effectively, this is very tricky to achieve, especially when you start on a new project. So a lot of us are consultants or working for an end client starting a new project. You might start working with new stakeholders. You might not know that well, that client, that industry. So it's kind of very tricky to get to an envisioning and a shared understanding very quickly. But I found that this is key for the success of your project, right? And to explain a bit more, let me share with you a story, a personal story of an envisioning that failed for me a couple of years ago, where I delivered a project and I didn't meet that shared understanding of the envisioning, to kind of better explain what I mean with that, right? So effectively, this whole journey for me to kind of master this envisioning started a couple of years ago, where I was leading a discovery engagement for a large bank, still in Belgium at that time. And I was leading a discovery project with another architect, and then we had a couple of workshops with key stakeholders of the bank, a couple of departments involved, and we use, the standard BA, business analysis techniques during those workshops, gathering requirements, demoing dynamics, demoing the solutions, and kind of writing down a high level architecture, refining, prioritizing requirements, and so forth. And then come the final presentation, where we have to deliver the outcome and the scope of the project, so the discovery covered really that scope and the roadmap for the project. So we come to the final presentation, and then massive room with all key stakeholders from the 5 departments. I don't know, like 30, 40 people in the room. Incredible how many people attended. And then I started effectively sharing the scope of that and the outcome of that discovery. And effectively, if I recall correctly, I started with customer service marketing. It went relatively well. And then when I came to the sales team, my presentation got absolutely smashed. The sales team lead almost exploded, saying that I completely missed her requirement, that she's not signing off that discovery. And then effectively, I tried to kind of argument with her, but there was absolutely no point, right? Something happened during the project where during that workshop or those workshops with that salesperson, we couldn't agree and we couldn't come to a shared understanding of the vision and the requirements that they were after. And that kind of exploded during the final presentation, right? And led, of course, to delays to the project, rework, stress, and everything bad that comes with a failed kind of engagement, right? So what effectively happened is that bad experience really hunted me for years, right? So I couldn't really understand what happened during that project, because for me everything was going well. During the project, nothing kind of flagged that it was going in the wrong direction. And effectively, this experience led me to try to understand why projects are failing, right? And there are a lot of reasons why projects are failing, of course. But one key one that I kind of understood over the last couple of years is that shared understanding of requirements and shared vision, right? So I made my goal, because of that bad experience that kind of bite me quite hard, I made my goal to kind of help individuals implementing Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform to really reduce miscommunication and rework, and then avoid stress and even burn down, right? And design thinking is one of the has some methods that really helps in kind of going all together into the same kind of direction. There are specific tools that I'll be sharing with you to kind of get to that same understanding of the vision and the requirements. Today, really my discovery and my envisioning looks completely different than a couple of years ago, right? I use a combination of techniques. So I didn't completely drop business analysis and the tools. I use a combination of business analysis, a combination of user adoption and design thinking methods to kind of help me in that process. And then overshare, kind of very visual, to kind of make sure, that my communication get and pass to my audience. I came to realize effectively that we have a limited control over how your stakeholders are communicating to us, right? If your product owner or one of your key stakeholders just simply missed to tell you something because they forgot during a workshop, well, that might lead to you miss requirements or miscommunication later on, right? So also various people communicate in very different ways, right? So we don't have control over how people communicate to us, but the big difference is we have control over how we communicate to our stakeholders, right? And this is really, for me, kind of the difference. So today, again, I overshare my ideas, my thought process. As you can see here, I use a combination of various diagrams, of stories, of interviews, of demos, of proof of concept, and so forth, to make sure that I express myself to my audience and I kind of trigger them to feedback their ideas back to me, to make sure that we have that same understanding as quickly as possible and have that smooth and nice project so that expectations are met at the end. Before going forward, a quick intro about design thinking, right? So what is effectively design thinking, and a kind of a standard definition. Then I will explain how I see design thinking being applied to a Dynamics 365 and Power Platform project. So design thinking is a non-linear, iterative process. So it's not a one-off It's iterative, so you repeat that process, which seeks to understand users, challenge assumptions, redefine problems, and create innovative solutions to prototype and test. Right? So let's unpick each of those here and try to apply them to effectively Dynamics 365 or Power Platform. So if you start with the empathize here, effectively what that means, it means that we want to understand our user as much as possible, right? So sit down next to them, see how they work. There is a tool that I use, a method that we call shadowing sessions, where you sit down next to your users and you really see how they work, feel their pain almost in doing some of the tasks, something that you might not always get during a normal requirements gathering workshop. Next one is define, right? So we want to make sure that we challenge the requirements, that we challenge some assumptions, that we challenge the way of working, because sometimes, when you start, you transition from working in Excel or in Outlook to Dynamics, there is a lot of habits that our people think might apply, but challenge that, because there will be some changes in the way people work. So it's a good time to challenge the way things are. So this is what we mean, right? We want to define and kind of challenge the assumptions here. And sometimes by doing that, you can come to the realization that Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform is maybe not the best tool to solve the current problems. Maybe a change in the team, organization of the internal team might be the solution, or effectively another tool, like I was saying, another tool than Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform might be actually a solution, right? So something that sometimes is not even technically related could be a solution. Ideate, again, here apply to Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. Step back a bit from those, right? There is more tools available to you. Office 365, Azure, the ISV world, right? So explore all those options. An example that springs to my mind is document management, right? There is so many different ways that you can, use for documents as a document management solution, right? In Dynamics, you have the notes entity, you have even that new entity now called file that you can use, but those are maybe not the best solution. There's the SharePoint integration, there is Azure Blob Storage, right? So many different ways of doing something. You want to make sure that you kind of step back a bit and explore those options to kind of come with an innovative solution. Prototype and test, those are kind of coming together in Dynamics 365, or I apply them together in Dynamics 365 Power Platform project, where I prototype a lot using, mockups. I use draw.io a lot, which is a tool to kind of make diagrams. You can use Visio or PowerPoint as well to do some prototyping and diagramming and so forth, and then test your idea, test your thinking, share those mockups, share those prototypes with your audience so that they can kind of test your thinking and provide you with valuable feedback, right? So this is how design thinking for me fits the Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform landscape. Just one quick slide before moving to the next one is how design thinking in red. Here, it's kind of growing. It's the trends over time versus, for example, in blue business analysis. You can see that effectively design thinking, there's a lot of interest growing up in those methods and techniques. The envisioning journey, right? So before really going to the methods I apply, to the design thinking methods I apply, I wanted to kind of step back and show you what is for me a typical envisioning journey for a project. So effectively, I kind of categorize this journey in 3 steps. You have your project context, that is effectively before even the project starts, right? We kind of want to, the company has a business plan, the company or your clients that implementing Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform, they have challenges, and then effectively they have a bunch of solutions and business benefits that will meet or kind of tackle those challenges, right? So before jumping in, it's very important that we understand the project context before going into the next kind of phase, right? And then before really starting to build something, what I recommend or what I often do is that project envisioning, which is kind of, we acquainted in the dynamics world to call it discovery. So it's almost like a discovery where we want to come together to that shared vision of what we're going to build. And this is the part where I use kind of design thinking methods, and I can kind of use also some of design thinking methods during the project delivery. But let me focus first on that project envisioning here using design thinking, right? So as I was saying before, well, effectively what you build during that envisioning is your product backlog and your project plan. So you want to make sure that you have your requirements defined, and then you have a project plan and scoping and a roadmap kind of defined. And these 5 steps that are inspired from design thinking will help you achieve that, right? So again, those 5 kind of steps that I described previously in the definition of design thinking are empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And I'll go into more details in my following slide to kind of map each of the activities that I do in those 5 steps. And then, of course, later you have your project delivery. Again, that is the typical envisioning journey where I have 3 kind of different phases, but sometimes they are a little bit intermingle together, where you might apply some of design thinking or even the envisioning as part or just a sprint before your delivery sprint. It really depends on the project context and the project you are implementing. And I have a slide about the best practices on how to apply the project envisioning within different kind of project that we're delivering. I have a slide that covers that a bit later in that presentation. So if we focus really on this project envisioning and the steps I usually do during that project envisioning, effectively, I always start with a kickoff presentation where I describe that process. So what are we going to do and the steps. I usually also identify my key users, and I use an old kind of method which is called UML use case diagram. I learned UML a couple of years ago, which kind of I found it very useful to identify really key users and key activities they do, because effectively I use this later to kind of invite those key users and those stakeholders to my workshops as well. Right, and then we want to make sure that we define the key success factors, and this is where I apply some of the design thinking methods that I'll be sharing with you in the next slide. So I apply, for example, the How-Might-We method. I apply the abstraction laddering, and I apply the importance difficulty matrix. Right, sometimes I apply others, but for the sake of the presentation today, I'll be defining those 2 and going into more details for those 3 methods in the following slides, right? What I also do as well as part of the empathize is effectively I do some interviews and shadowing sessions, user journey maps and pain points, right? But effectively, very often I do those user shadowing sessions to make sure I empathize enough with my users. And then kind of more typical approach where I have my requirements validation workshops, where feeding from this information provided here, I start, kind of validating the key success factors, validating conceptual diagram and entity diagram and all kind of different diagrams that you need to have to kind of share your ideas. I usually use scenarios and stories to go through my requirements to make it easier for my users to understand and kind of feel almost the situation. And of course, I use a lot of demos and proof of concept, right? After the first requirements validation workshop, I prototype and mock up based on the feedback I got here. And then I sometimes use proof of concept, so kind of sandbox environments of dynamics where I kind of tweak and prototype and kind of conceptualize the ideas so that I can reuse those 2. So I can reuse my prototypes, mockups, and proof of concept. I can reuse them in that iteration in my next requirements validation workshops. And I kind of go through a round of requirements validation workshops each time kind of refining the prototypes and the mock-ups and refining the proof of concepts, and then going back and playing that back to my audience to make sure that we are on the same page. And when I'm happy, or when we reach out the content that we needed to cover during the requirements validation workshops, we have, of course, the closing presentation, and then we kind of present back to the audience what we have achieved, the deliverables, the scope, the roadmap, and the vision, including those kind of diagrams, like a conceptual diagram, to make sure, again, that we are on the same page, right? Right, so next slides will be really focusing on those design thinking methods I use in here to kind of give you a flavor on how really and what it is design thinking and how I apply design thinking in Dynamics 365, right? So one method I use, it's called the How Might We, which is a method that allows your team to take the insights and pain points and then positively reframe them. So effectively, you want to make sure that you capture the pain points and you reframe them as opportunities, and you reframe them using the how might we. So how does it work, right? So usually it's about 20-30 minutes of exercise where me or you have a facilitator that is going to lead the session, and then you have your audience. So what you do, you ask kind of insightful questions, right? So I ask, if you're going to implement, for example, a portal for clients, so let's say the clients has Dynamics and want to expand that to have a portal to give access to their clients, I ask my audience, well, you know what? Let's step back. Please define me what is the system that we are implementing. Describe me the portal that we're implementing, right? And they start discussing. And if there is a bit of there is not enough discussions, I really ask each members one by one to give their opinion, right? To kind of keeping the conversation alive, I also say, what is the problem that the portal is going to solve for us, right? So let's please explain it. And while each one is kind of describing what is the portal for them, what is the problem they're going to solve with the portal, I ask them to write on sticky notes how might we statements. So if someone is saying, the portal, it's a user interface where client can log in, or going to display critical information for them, right? So that might be a good how might we to capture. So maybe another stakeholder captured here. So, so this might be a how might we provide the correct information to our clients, right? So that's a nice how might we statement that effectively got kind of one of the stakeholders wrote them because there were a discussion. We were all discussing about those insightful questions, right? And effectively, each of the stakeholders will come up with a couple of how might we's, 2, 3, 4, depending, right? As I said, you want to limit the time of this whole how might we exercise to a couple of minutes, because the whole length will be 20-30 minutes depending on the size of the audience. And then you come up with a bunch of how might we statements, right? So for portals, for example, here if we have 3 just as an example. How might we provide the correct information to our clients? Another stakeholder wrote, how might we help our clients better engage with us? And then the last one is, how might we reduce the number of phone calls from our clients, right? So you stick them all on a whiteboard, or if you use tools now, there's a lot of tools that we use to engage with online with the audience, like Miro, Klaxoon are 2 tools that I've seen. I'm starting to use Miro personally myself, where you can share, a board and people can kind of interact with the board. So after we have put all those sticky notes on a board, you ask your member to vote, right? So effectively what's happening, each one kind of vote for the how might be statements they think might be the most suitable for the project, right? So that's kind of framing and making sure that we're solving, the correct problems with the how might we. Next exercise I do, which is the input of the how might we, is the abstraction laddering. So if you recall, that how might we statement that was most voted on, I use that how might we statement to kind of go a bit more in details and understand, the broader picture, and then how we're going to achieve that, right? And this is where I use the abstraction laddering, where abstraction laddering is a way of, reconsidering a problem statement by broadening and narrowing its focus. So broadening, asking why, and narrowing, asking how. So effectively what you do, again, you ask the same audience, okay, we have chosen the how might we previously, so how we provide the correct information to our clients, right? Tell me why. Why is it so important, right? And then you kind of get people to write down why is it important. And again, they write down some idea to improve client satisfaction, to increase self-service and reduce cost, right? To save time for our clients and our staff. And those kind of whys will help us kind of broadening and maybe finding effectively all the problems we want to solve. And then we do the same, but on going to the how might we actually solve? So how might we provide the correct information to our clients? How are you going to do that, right? What are the specific tools that you're going to use for that, right? The specific steps or the actions that you're going to take to do that. And effectively here, for example, again, for portal, right? People will write down on sticky notes, each one, right? So you ask each member to write down on sticky notes the how, and then, for example, here it's, one will say how. Well, first we need to determine the key information that we want to display to our clients, right? Otherwise, we don't know what is important for them. Yeah, perfect, correct statement. Maybe we provide, an FAQ, right? So we come up with a list of FAQ and we put it on the portal, right? Or we start having, a chat functionality, or we have virtual agent functionality, right? So all these are, and there is no wrong or right, bad idea. Just let your stakeholders put whatever ideas they have, because the next step is effectively, again, you're going to ask them to vote, right? So each one comes and then put their votes on what is the how that is the most impactful they think for them to solving that how might we statement. And then the last but not least that I'm covering during my presentation today is the importance difficulty matrix, which effectively here is kind of a 2-axis matrix where effectively you're going to plot the items by relative value versus difficulty, right? Versus cost. So for example, all your how from the abstraction laddering, you plot them on this chart here, where effectively actually cost, it's sometimes here, it's also rendered as difficulty, right? But if effectively, how much value do one of the how statement gives versus how costly or how difficult is it to implement? So for example, here again, from the previous exercise, determine key information to display to our clients. It's relatively easy to do, right? Because it's kind of sitting down, maybe a workshop or two, and defining that list of key information we need to provide to our clients on our portal. Brings a lot of value already, because maybe we don't even need the portal, right? As long as we understand what is very important for them, maybe we can find another way of sharing that information with them, right? So very important to start with this. And then provide virtual agent, right? Virtual agent now with Microsoft Virtual Agent is kind of easy to implement, and it's still, well, you still have to pay, for the license and so forth, but kind of the implementation and starting the configuration of this can be relatively straightforward in a sense. So it might bring a lot of value. Again, this is just an example, right? Just to illustrate here, the order might be completely different. And again, you ask your stakeholders to effectively put those sticky notes, but then they need to argument and discuss why one is closer to the value versus the cost than another. So it's kind of it should be kind of an active discussions to come up with this, and then effectively that can help you determine your key priorities that you want to implement for your system. So again, right, shared understanding of what we need to do, shared understanding of the vision for your system. So really helping all the time in that. Right, those, as I said, those are the 3 methods I wanted to share with you now some best practices, right? So there's a lot of steps that I describe in that project envisioning here, and all those activities that I run here, and I don't always apply those. This is kind of the ideal world where I apply all of them. Look, and this applies probably to new and typical projects where I kind of work, which is more around the 3 to 6 months time frame, up to a year, 2 to 5, 60 members. So that typical envisioning then take place. So I'm usually proposing that we have that discovery at the beginning to kind of have that shared vision, shared understanding requirements, and that usually takes about 2 to 4 weeks time, depending again of the scope and so forth. But as I was saying, this kind of project, if it's new and if of that size, then effectively it takes about 2 to 4 weeks to run that project envisioning and run all those activities. Now, not all the projects are new, not all the projects are of that size. So what happens, for example, existing projects, there's a lot of engagement where I come at midway project, or it's an enhancement. So if you land on a project midway through, well, it's more a pick and choose. Again, you cannot apply the whole round. It will be kind of tricky maybe for you to apply the whole round, because you are in the middle of the agile kind of implementation. But your analysis kind of step, or your story time workshop that you have with your user, you can apply some of the design thinking methods, kind of the user shadowing. If you have conflicting or conflicting requirements or ambiguous requirements, you can use some of the design thinking methods I covered, like the high might we, or the important matrix as well, will kind of help you making sure that you're going to challenge or work on the most valuable requirements for your clients, right? Enhancements, again, if you have a project that's live and there is a small enhancements, again, you can kind of pick and choose which method you want. Ideation for future state, this is more, you have a project in flight, or essentially, you have a project in flight and the clients want to, ideate for some future solution to kind of expand that with a new big project. Effectively, this is kind of maybe a shorter, because we don't really know if Dynamics or the Power Platform will be yet the correct tools. Those are maybe kind of initial kind of envisioning. But again, you can apply this kind of framework and this kind of steps to, go through your project envisioning. And then, of course, smaller projects. I have also a couple of small projects going on, and then those goes from a couple of days to a couple of weeks, usually 1 or 2 team members. And again, it's a pick and choose, and it's not there that sometimes I cover this whole project envisioning in a couple of hours, effectively maybe 2 hours, to have that session at the beginning, sit down with the users, then one requirement validation workshop of an hour or 2, then we prototype, we do a little bit of proof of concept, a couple of hours, and then back to a second or third workshop, and effectively, yeah, that's it, because the project is kind of small. So you don't have to have all those items kind of in days, but it can be really condensed. You can have a couple of those items in 1 day or even a couple of hours, because your project is way smaller. All right, so we're running into the last effectively slide that I have for you, and I thought to prepare just kind of a what next from here. So effectively, if design thinking is kind of interest to you and we want to learn a bit more, and it's what I did as well to kind of learning and understanding, is there's a couple of good courses on LinkedIn. There's other platforms that offer a couple of good courses, but the 2 courses I would recommend is design thinking understanding the process, and then design thinking implementing the process. They are kind of 1 hour, I think, each, and kind of walk you through what is design thinking. And then after that, really, there's a lot of different design thinking, almost methodology. IDEO. What I found quite valuable, it's the Google Design Sprints. So there is you can find it on Google. There's a lot of videos on YouTube as well, where it takes again the design thinking principle and applies them in kind of a process, a 5-day. It's a 5-day sprint where you apply from day 1, day 2, day 3 specific design thinking methods. Not everything applies to dynamics, but it will help you understand, and maybe it will help you effectively pick some of the methods so that you can apply them on your project. There we go. Thank you very much for your time. Again, thank you very much for DynamicsCon for organizing this great conference, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Reach out to me. My LinkedIn details are on the DynamicsCon website, so don't hesitate to reach out to me. Provide me your feedback, what you like, what you dislike, if you use design thinking, how you using. I'm very interested to learning. It's a journey for me. So in a couple of months time, I'm sure I'll have new kind of ideas and my process will be changed. So please reach out to me to give me your feedback. So thank you again for your time today. So join me into the conference chat where I can respond to some of your questions.